I sense a rising anti-intellectualism in this nation, don't you? The other day I was hanging floss out on the line to dry. This guy comes to our house, says, "I'd like to read your gas meter." I said, "Whatever happened to the classics?"
We're going to devote our energies to sports and gardening, all the cultural pursuits as far as they're concerned. In fact, we're going to put the goons to sleep. Meanwhile, we dig.
Greetings and welcome to The Anatomist. This is Burn Power coming to you from Tbilisi, Georgia on a day that started quite blue and wonderful and is now overcast and wonderful. It's a nice day. No complaints. I love overcast days, so no complaints from me. I had these thoughts about stories. In a sense, we're always thinking about stories. You go to a movie, you're thinking about stories. You read a novel, obviously you're thinking about stories. But you're thinking about stories when you're watching the news. You're thinking about stories reading comic books. You're even thinking about stories playing video games. In fact, if you go and watch a sporting event, you're thinking about the stories. The story of defeat or victory of these usually two, opposing entities. And in fact, even when things seem very abstract, the great ballet choreography, George Balanchine, who was Georgian, by the way, half Georgian, said, people would say, there's just two people. What's the story? There's a man and a woman. He says, well, don't you understand? If you put a man and a woman on the stage dancing around each other, you already have a story. Because, of course, the story of male and female is one of the oldest and deepest stories we have. And I have thought about stories for years. I've thought about stories I write stories. You haven't seen many of them, and I do need to get my novel self-published this year, Lord Willing and the Creek Don't Rise. But of course, I'm always putting together a story of history. Every one of these videos is a story. There's a story behind it, how I came up with the idea. There's the little story that involves me setting up the camera, focusing it, deciding what I'm going to use as my style of photography. Also deciding how I came to this idea, what idea I'm even talking about. There are stories behind everything. Now, one thing that, shall we call them realists, often say is that stories are just an illusion in a sense because things never end. So, maybe I die, but the world goes on without me. There's no end to the story. However, I think that's not exactly honest. And I think that the idea that stories don't actually exist, or certainly not in the form of a story, I think there's something dishonest to that. Because in fact, every birth and every death is the beginning and the end of a story. And yes, there are stories that came before it, but we can say circumscribed within that birth and death is the life of a person. Now, they're set in an environment, they're set in a time, they're set in a country, they're set in a family. And of course, these things didn't start when I was born, nor do they end when I die or you die. And as far as we know through science, there is a beginning to this whole story of, we'll just call it the universe for a moment. But if you look at the Bible, there's a beginning to the story as well. You look at the story of Christ, there's a beginning to that story. And there are endings. For instance, we are now no longer in any degree related to the 20th century anymore. I mean, yes, the 20th century totally informs who we are. It is, to use that terrible phrase, our backstory. I hate that. The best word is history, not backstory. But story makes up everything. We tell each other stories. We tell each other jokes that are stories. We tell each other the incidents of the day. Of course, some people are better storytellers than others. And that's, how you tell a story is almost sometimes as important as what you tell. Two people can tell the same story and tell very different versions of that story. And we'll come to this concept in a moment when we talk about the next word, which will be narrative. But we have mythology. Those are stories. Legends, epics, those are stories. Romances, Gothic literature, detective stories, mysteries, action stories. They're all stories. And we as human beings seem to be creatures that get our central nutrition about meaning from the stories we consume. Now, there are all sorts of issues with these stories in the present moment, and one of those issues is we have access to so many stories. Right now you can go on any sort of screen and at the touch of a finger find hundreds and hundreds and thousands of probably millions of stories. So what does that tell you then about yourself if there's too much input coming in? And what does the story explain? Now, I have too many thoughts about stories to really start unpacking it all here. So what I have instead thought about, this is just, a little bit of an introduction to some of my thoughts about stories. But one of the things I've thought about is the difficulty that now exists with telling stories. In a sense, that difficulty has always been there, but now we have an actual philosophical component to it, which has gone deep into our culture, which has made stories a source of, warfare, intellectual warfare, imaginative warfare, warfare of all kinds, sometimes physical warfare. People go to war based on the stories in their head. Which brings us to this philosophical thing that has changed for us. And it's called narrative. Now, narrative, the way we normally use the word, is a series of events or a constructed series of events. So sometimes people will say, construct a narrative of X event. This sometimes happens when you go to apply a job. Give us a narrative of your life prior to coming to work for us and why you think you would work for us based on your narrative. The difference between a narrative and a story, I think, is great. I think the story is the food. That's the real thing. They have beginnings, middles, and ends. They're told well or they're not told well. But a narrative can just be bullet points on a page. A narrative can have no beginning and end. A narrative can just be this happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. Now, of course, you can see that a story is a narrative. But a narrative isn't necessarily a story. Now, one of the things that's happened is that this simple, useful word narrative, sometime in the late 20th century, through particularly French philosophy, started to take on a lot of extra baggage. That is to say, the narrative became our means of finding some sort of explanation for things. And I would say it takes the place of story. Story is where we get our nutrition, our spiritual nutrition. But narrative like I say, it can be abstract. It can be just a series of random events. This happened, and this happened, and this happened. Doesn't have to make any sense at all. Now, one of the things that happened, and I'm not going to go off into a deep analysis of postmodern philosophy, because frankly, I can't do it. Now, that is to say, I haven't read Derrida and all the rest of them. My brain is stopping for a moment, but I could give you the rest of the names, but I'm not going that direction. But what happened was these ideas came down through philosophy, and they entered the bloodstream of society. Now, when ideas enter the bloodstream of society, for instance, existentialism in the 50s and early 60s enters the bloodstream of society, and by the time you get to, for instance, the existentialist type movies that Americans were making, had nothing to do with France, although they were all influenced by French films, in the 1970s, it's a very different thing than Jean-Paul Sartre or Camus. Likewise, the way postmodernism has come to us culturally is very different than the philosophy. And it's very important to make a difference between the philosophy and the outworkings in culture. So postmodern culture that we live in and still are, when people are now using this buzzword meta-narrative, meta-modern is the right word. When they're using that word, they're still talking postmodernism. It's just a specific style of postmodernism. And postmodernism, among the many things that are said in a postmodern framework, is that there is no more meta-narrative to explain the world to ourselves. So a meta-narrative would be Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity. It can also be modernism. That is to say, it's not necessarily that, it's the thing that explains everything to ourselves. Now, on one hand, there's a bit of humility in saying, okay, not one person's, not one viewpoint's explanation narrative will explain everything to us. But that created, by the time that got down to the level where people live, which is where we are now, that created a very strange effect. And that effect is that narrative ceased being simply that bullet point of events. 1, 2, 3, 4. This happened, then this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And because it was stated that no one narrative is meta enough. It can explain everything in a complete comprehensive way, which is something I question, but that's because I'm a Christian. But I'm not going to go there right now. But the problem is once you say that, and once that idea gets away from the philosophers and the intellectuals, then goes into the artists, and then into popular culture, and then into daily life, as the trickle-down effect gets to us. Then the narrative stops meaning that thing. If no one narrative means everything, then you're just left with a collection of different narratives. So you have the Buddhist narrative, you have the Hindu narrative, you have the Armenian narrative, and you have the Azerbaijan narrative, and you have the American narrative, and you have the Russian narrative, and you have the narrative of the 17th century during the Baroque era, and you have the narrative of high modernism around 1960. And all of these things just end up being almost of equal weight, except, of course, people really don't feel that. A person who has swallowed the woke narrative, for instance, actually thinks that their narrative is the meta-narrative. So, but that means when we hear the word narrative now, what we're really hearing isn't the word narrative anymore. It's the word spin. Now, I remember when I was young, people didn't really talk about political spin. That is to say, as I was growing up in the 60s, and you started hearing a bit about it at the end of the 70s, and by the 80s, the word spin showed up. And spin was what kind of, it's a spin, it's a circle. What kind of, what can we attach to this? What kind of funk can we, make this do? So, for instance, if we were to talk about the Christian right, how can we, just through using the word Christian right, make it seem kind of like it's got a bit of an odor to it? The spin, the funk, the thing that attaches itself, its aura, you could say. How do we put that on there? And so that's what the political spin meisters would do, spin doctors. They would put these things on. Now, this is all coming from the realm of propaganda. Interestingly enough, I find that the people who talk most about meta-narrative seem to know the least about propaganda. That is to say, they're so fixated on the equality of all the narratives and how none of them explain everything. Therefore, we're left in a kind of a nihilistic existentialist stew where, everyone just does what they're on. So we no longer have our right-wing or left-wing narratives. We have our individual narratives. It's not just our tribe anymore, it's ourself. This is the narrative for myself. This is how I live. I'm number one. You're looking out for number one, as they said in the 70s. But nowadays, it's just like people say, I'm following my dream, to which I want to say, well, why? What makes your dream worth following? Do you have your own personal mythology? Is your story the most interesting story? So I think that what's happened is now spin is the narrative. That is to say, and it's got this propaganda hook underneath it. And as Jacques Ellul said in his book Propaganda, as soon as you have mass communication, you already have propaganda. And he wasn't saying that in the sense of they're all telling lies. He was saying that in the sense of you can't communicate on a mass level without propaganda. And that's what people are doing. Unfortunately, that takes away from genuine conversation. And genuine conversation can be distinguished from propaganda in that it's subtle, in that it is the kind of thing that you have to wrestle back and forth with, and you do it in person. Whatever I'm saying now, there is a bit of a little propaganda thing just because you're watching this on a televisual device. And if you were talking to me more in the room, say, as I often have conversations here in my room in Tbilisi, you can see the moment you say something that someone kind of looks at you like a dog looks at you and goes, what does that mean? Or, what are you talking about? Or, that's really interesting. And you can see it, and then you adjust your conversation, which I can't do here. So I end up being the person who speaks. Fortunately, we can have a little bit of a discussion through the comments. And also, fortunately, my channel isn't huge. The bigger your channel gets, the more you start using propaganda techniques or advertising techniques, same difference, to communicate. So you start saying to yourself, how am I going to reach them? How am I going to make the algorithms? How am I going to get this? Now, all that's connected to how we tell our stories. But here is the tragedy. Nowadays, and this is what I really want to get to. Nowadays, when a movie comes out, when a story comes out, when a video game comes out, when a piece of music that incorporates a story in it comes out, when anything comes out, the elements in the story, we've gotten too good, too critical of all the elements in the story. So that as soon as, take two archetypal characters who might show up in a story. Yeah, they're archetypal, but they're also related to real human beings. One is you have born-again Christian in a story. Two is you have a gay, let's say gay man in a story. So you have these two characters. Now, as soon as you put one of those characters in, or both of them, everyone watching it is now immediately saying to themselves, what are you going to do with this character? So rather than hearing your story, they're immediately looking for, what's happened is this idea that there's no meta-narrative has sunk down into who we are. There is no, so people no longer believe stories. And what's happened is mass storytelling has sunk to such a level that as soon as you watch the latest Marvel movie or the latest Star Wars television series, as soon as you watch an action film, as soon as you watch a romance, you're immediately looking at the elements. You're saying, someone's saying, is this LGBTQIA whatever friendly? Or they're saying, I'm a Pentecostal. Is this good for my interpretation of the Bible? And we're immediately judging the elements, and we're really suspicious of any element that doesn't correspond to our particular narrative. And now you could honestly say, this has always been true. People have always been suspicious of elements that don't fit their narrative. However, we've reached a very different place with that. It's not simply that, an atheist wanders into a church and hears they believe in God and goes like, this is wrong. It's not on that level at all. It's gotten to the point where we see the elements in a story. So one of the problems that's happened with storytelling, and I think if I do a longer series, do you want me to do a longer series on storytelling? Let me know. I've got some notes scrawled out and I'm thinking about it. And it would be more like this, just dialogue. It's not me using a lot of imagery. One of the problems is that we have learned all these phrases. So, for instance, you're watching a television show and you say to yourself, that character's not going to die. They have plot armor. Someone else says, oh, that character, they're following the hero's journey. Someone else says, it's like they're on their story arc. Now, as soon as you start using these phrases, which have a certain kind of validity, you suddenly find yourself really in trouble. Because, for one thing, you, the person watching or taking part in the story, now are taking part in creating the story and saying they should do this. Then it starts to really get into being a house of mirrors when the people, because of our interactivity on the internet, they get feedback. And then they change things because of the feedback. This happened in Game of Thrones, where George R.R. Martin at one point knows that someone guessed what was coming, so he changed certain elements of his story because he felt like people were already guessing what it was. And this has happened with other stories as well. And that's really dangerous for storytelling. Why is it dangerous for storytelling? It's dangerous for storytelling because what that means is the story can't be made first. Television is the worst at this, and especially the Netflix-style television, because we are all too interactive with it, and not in the healthy way of watching your audience as you're telling a story. A storyteller, if I was telling a story here, for instance, telling a story about bears in Alaska, or telling us, one of the crime stories I could tell you from New York City, and I had a group of people here, I could tell that everyone's listening, and they might go, what about this? And they might interject something. But the one thing they're probably not going to do, unless they have direct knowledge of that situation, is interrupt the story to say, this is getting predictable. What they're really listening for is whether the story is good and an interesting story. That's what they're really doing when they're in person. But in social media, people are sitting there saying, I don't think that should happen in the plot. I hope this doesn't happen. And I understand why they do it, because of the nature. For instance, television writing is terrible. Say a show like Lost. They had no idea how they were going to end the thing at the beginning. There were some things they put in, but then the story just started to wander and go away. And I remember I was watching Lost with my mother before she passed away, and at one point I said, "Mom, do you want to watch the next season of Lost?" I would get it once a year because I didn't watch television, but I would get the DVDs. And she'd go like, "Oh, no, I can't follow that." And I think the point is the writers couldn't follow it either. And the problem with television writing and serial writing, including comic books and video games are often serial writing as well, is that they're so dependent on the way people are interpreting it. So you get this House of Mirrors effect where the audience is now saying, we're not sure what you're doing. We don't know. You shouldn't do that. So, and because I write stories, I tend to, when I watch a story, I don't interrupt it in my mind along the way and go, "Oh my gosh, you shouldn't have done that." I say, "No, let's go to the end of the story and see how it ends. Then I'll start thinking about it." But, there are videos of people who are just reacting to something on television, a series, or they're reacting to a movie they've never seen for the first time. And what they're doing is they're talking to it, or they're reacting as they go. Then other people watch them reacting. And it breeds these weird House of Mirror effects is the best way to explain it. But it's a kind of a collective effect. And which is one reason I decided quite a while ago not to do any serial storytelling. Because I felt like, right now to do serial storytelling is such a dangerous thing. Because, for instance, there is a video game, The Last of Us, and everyone really loved that, who loved that sort of game. And then the second one went a lot heavier with the LGBTQR whatever stuff. And people started really reacting, as perhaps they should have. But in between the first one and the second one, and now we have a situation where the first movie, or rather limited series on Netflix, had a very good review, but you can see everyone's going to get really worried about the second one, whether it's going to follow the direction of the video games, which, from everything I heard, and I sat and watched people play the game because I'm not going to waste my time trying to get through that sort of thing. I said, what is that character? Oh, they're kind of transy. They're purposely blurring the line. Why? Because it was like 2021 or so when it came out, 2020. So there are things that happen that are so time-oriented that they no longer have any real value outside of that timeline, outside of our timeline. Once you go a few years down the road, the same story that looked really like saying something in 1 year, 3 years later, doesn't look like it's saying the same thing. So, now, when I sat and wrote, I have a novel called The Five Masters of Reality. And without getting into it, I hope someday you have a chance to read it. And I hope that day is before the end of the year. That's my hope. It's been finished since 2005 or 6. And and I know what the problem is. And the whole reason I can't even get it professionally published is I kept getting the same letter back from agents. You wrote this really well. We just can't touch it. And the reason they can't touch it is I didn't follow the formulas, because storytelling in the 21st century is a perilous thing. And I wrote that. The first draft came in the year 2000. Then there was a major revision around 3-4 years later. But one of the things I made sure I did is I just went off into the woods and wrote it. I borrowed someone's cabin and wrote it. And the one thing I didn't want to think about was how people are going to react to this. I just wanted to get the thing in my head out on the page. Now that is exactly the kind of thing that the commercial systems for story consumption today do not want us to do. They don't want us to get these works that are coming from an honest perspective. I mean, I hope mine is honest. It was just thinking about that novel took years, like 15. And of just kind of going over the story, telling it to different people. And, but I can say this, it's certainly not politically correct by any standards. I don't think my Christian friends are going to be really comfortable with it, and I don't think my certainly the woke folks aren't going to like it at all. But I think a lot of people who watch this channel would read that and go like, whoa, this is dark. And I've allowed about, I guess, around 20 people to read it, and the response has always been good and strong. And so one person, who shall remain nameless, a very good friend, I said, well, eventually I'm going to get this published. And she said, now, Bern, don't get your hopes up. And I understand why she's saying that, because it's a really dicey thing. And I said, yeah, but everyone's told me this is pretty good, and I think it's pretty good. And she goes, well, Bern, I just don't want you to get your hopes up. And so I let her have a copy of it to read. She printed it up and read it, because you can't read it on files. That's ridiculous. And halfway through, she called me up and was just apologizing. And why was she apologizing? As she said, I didn't know you had this in me. And she knew me pretty well. And you may think you know me pretty well, because you watch a lot of videos of mine. But trust me, this is a different sort of thing. It's one of the reasons why I have a separate channel called La Crematorium for my artistic outworkings, which don't relate to this stuff at all, except that this is where I actually work out my artistic ideas. But when I work out my artistic ideas, I am never consciously saying, I have to do this to make this kind of a philosophical, creative, political, whatever point. Because I think when you do your artwork, or when you do your writing, or when you create a story, you just have to make it. Later you can sit and say, what did I do? What was this? And at some point I may talk about, I think there are different layers of intuition, and then you have to have a layer of critical examination and further knowledge. And then you go to another layer of intuition, which includes all the things you learn, but now you turn your brain off. Well, you don't turn your brain off. You just turn that side. For instance, I have another novel that has a 400-page rough draft. And the reason I can't work on it is because it's handwritten and it's back in Alaska. Another reason you should think about helping me get my stuff here. A little plug. So, but the point is, I wrote it by hand so that I had no temptation to look things up in the middle of the writing to make sure I had my facts. I did a lot of research ahead of time, and then I just spit it out day after day after day. And I made sure I couldn't just click a button and suddenly I'd be looking at, Wikipedia or some specialized page on a subject. I just wanted to spit the idea out. So, what am I trying to say? One, we need a new appreciation for stories that doesn't include always thinking about what it means politically. We need just good stories. Just good stories. As Balanchine says, just putting a man and woman on stage, you're already telling a story. Just their movements back and forth, whether they approach each other or not. Likewise, a story. Just putting the elements down, and I have lots of thoughts about the elements. And I've thought a lot more about storytelling than any of you understand yet. But I just thought this would be an opening salvo into the realm of storytelling. Something that I think might be of value, because the truth is, if you understand it correctly, we need stories like we need air, like we need water, like we need food, like we need clothing, like we need love. like we need truth. And while people have been so suspicious about the meta-narrative, a lot of people haven't noticed actually the world is growing into one big mega-narrative, which then throws doubts upon the idea that there's nothing that explains it all. Because if it's all one huge story, then some explanations are going to be a bit closer to the truth than others. I'll just leave that there. What to do? Well, get yourself exercised in the realm of story so that you can recognize a good story. And here are some things you can do. Read mythology. Not modernized versions where, don't watch the Disney story of Little Mermaid and think you understand the Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. Read Hans Christian Andersen. Read fairy tales. Read legends. Read classic stories. Read the histories, for instance. If you're a Christian, read the Bible. If you're not a Christian, just read history. And I say read it more than consume it on video, because the video give you a big smack in the face with some images, and you hear someone say something. But I get more from a couple of paragraphs of good historical writing, as I just finished up Lucy Lethbridge's book called Tourists, which was basically a history of tourism in England and the UK from about the year 1800 till about the 1970s or 80s. And she really did her homework. Do I agree with everything? That's not the point. The point is I have a narrative in my head. I've read other books on history. I have even more. So I have an active story. You see, at one point, there was no tourism as we understand it now. So it means there was a beginning. Of course, these things go back into history. The Romans did a little bit of traveling. There were pilgrimages. But here is the point. Everything is a story. But before you enter into the daily stories that you're being confronted with in the news, on YouTube, the drama that's happening with this person or that person, before you soak yourself in that, which all has the spin connected with it. It's all got a propaganda edge to it. Before you can do that, you need to read the stories that are just the stories. And they really are. That is, and they may come out of a certain perspective. That might be a Jewish story like the Golem, or it might be a French story like the story of Beauty and the Beast is a French fairy tale. And when you realize who there's a character named Bluebeard, and when you realize who that was based on, you go, oh, that's a frightening story. But the point is to get story, and not the explanations of story. I really have great problems with Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey. I really have great problems with everyone being so familiar with all these little story terms like the, character arc and plot armor and all of these things. Because it means when you're watching something, you're no longer watching it just simply to get the story. Rather, you're watching it, I watch, say, movies from the 1930s and 40s that are set in deepest, darkest Africa. And you know what I'm not saying to myself while I'm watching it? Ooh, that's a racist depiction. I'm not saying to myself, oh, there's the great white hero trope. I'm saying to myself, okay, so what is Tarzan going to do here? I'm asking myself about the story. When I'm done, I can then go back and use the structuralist approach and look at the elements. I mean, I've done that with all of my ideas. So I remember with my friend Karsten, we spent one summer watching vampire movies together while he was in Alaska, and another summer watching haunted house movies. And we watched lots of these things. And you start noticing the tropes, the characters, and all of these things that show up in movie after movie. And then you notice the ones that stick out. But while I'm watching it, I'm not necessarily thinking about that stuff. I'm just thinking about, I'm watching The Haunting of Hell House right now. And the Roddy McDowall character, it's just like, I'm looking at him and such. I'm not bringing the full weight of my intellectual critical artillery on the thing. I'm simply enjoying the story, if I can. If it's at all interesting, I'll walk out and look for the interesting parts. And then a few minutes later, I'll go, okay, and then there's all these problems with the story. Or it's an apologia for this particular idea. Okay, so I'm done. If you want more thoughts of my story thoughts, let me know. If only a few people comment, I'll know that this didn't matter much to you. But I hope you enjoyed it. So this is Byrne. You can subscribe. You can like it. That helps these blind idiot gods, to use the H.P. Lovecraft phrase, of the algorithms to push it around. But, the truth is, I just hope that anyone who watches it gets something out of this. And this is true with all of the things I'm doing. So, from Tbilisi, Georgia, this is Byrne. By the way, I have a name for my new channel, but I'll tell you maybe next time. Drovadi, temporarily. We will meet again.
A people without history is not redeemed from time. For history is a pattern of timeless moments.
As soon as the master returns, you die. All of you.
Princess, you were bewitched. Break the mirror before it's too late. Break the spell he cast over you. Untie me! Help me before it's too late!
And what would you save me from, Prince Charming? My reflection? Look at me. Gaze upon my true self. Am I not beautiful? Why be the Princess of Cornwall when I can be Queen of all England? Think of it. How exciting. A witch on the throne of England. I forgot. Pity you won't be there.